Morning from a sunny Colombia. I'm sorry we've been a little bit late. We had a few technical issues, as we always bound to have on these sorts of things. We're here at COP16, and if you've no idea what COP16 is about, we've got an expert here to tell us all about it, who's been to many, many COPs. So fantastic. She's going to explain all. So say hello, Sarah.
Hi, nice to meet you.
So it was the welcoming ceremony last night, so I think we're going to just have a little bit of music from the ceremony just to kick things off. Well, that was just a little bit of fun from last night. I mean, it was the welcome ceremony last night before the hard work begins on day one here in the negotiations here. And we're in the middle of the tents that are all around this conference centre. There's these air-conditioned tents, they're quite nice actually, where all the hard work begins. And there's loads of side events going on, but crucially, all of these negotiations going on. So, Sarah, I'm just going to hand over to you really to explain what this is all about. So, I mean, let's begin with this Convention of Biological Diversity. What is that? What does it mean?
Great, and lovely to be here today. So, Convention of Biodiversity is actually one of three big COPs known as the Rio Convention. So they were all agreed in 1992 in Rio. And the ones that you probably have heard of is the Climate Change Convention, which is the one that most people have heard of that meets every year. And then there is two others, so this Biodiversity Convention and then another one on desertification. So this Biodiversity Convention basically has the objective of conserving all life on Earth, and it meets every 2 years. This year, 190 countries are coming together, and they're expecting about 15,000 people here. So it's going to be very busy over the next 2 weeks. And what are they going to be talking about here? Well, 2 years ago, at the last COP in Montreal, there was an agreement which is likened to the Paris Agreement under the Climate Change Convention, which agreed something called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that's sort of this global plan that all governments agreed, which sets out a direction that all countries now need to take, what they need to do to conserve nature and biodiversity in their own countries. So it's this global framework, and it's underpinned by 23 targets that governments are now taking back to their own countries, and actually translating that into national plans to say, what are we going to do at the national level to actually contribute to that overall global plan.
So Sarah, this sounds like an awful lot of paperwork, an awful lot of talk. Just see if you can explain to me, how do you relate that international convention to actual work on the ground in, say, a country like the United Kingdom?
Okay, so let's take the United Kingdom. So what they do, they take those 23 targets that were agreed under the Global Biodiversity Framework, and then they translate them into something called, and forgive me for the acronym, a National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan.
They're really good at the old bureaucracy in this international world, but there's reasons for it. Anyway,
exactly. So those 23 targets will have things like conserving 30% of land and seas, transforming things like negative subsidies, agricultural subsidies, as well as things like providing finances for developing countries to actually help them with conserving their nature and biodiversity as well. So the UK is actually taking all of those 23 targets, and they're saying, which of these are now relevant for the UK, and what do we do and what do we need to do in the UK to actually turn from being quite a nature-depleted country, it must be said, to actually start to put the UK on the road to nature recovery.
And do they have to do these things, or is it a fun thing?
So the convention itself is not legally binding, but the UK has signed up, and therefore there is an anticipation that they will do this. So it's not legally binding, but very, shall we say, strongly encouraged. And there is a lot of eyes, including from the Wildlife Trusts and all the other environmental NGOs and actors in the UK, who now are really holding the UK government's feet to the fire on this.
Yeah, so this is a kind of advocacy piece in a way. So I mean, just to give an example, I think one of the targets is to halve pollution use by 2030, is it? Which sounds like a pretty tall order. What sort of steps would the UK government have to do to kind of put a target like that into play?
So what they tend to do on these things is basically sort of look at, okay, what is causing those pollutions? A lot of the time it's sort of industrial manufacturing, and then start to put caps on those pollutions. So for example, whether that means a reduction in things like fertilizer use or pesticide use that farmers use on fields, or whether that's a reduction in harmful chemicals that are pumped into the air. That's the sorts of things that the UK would do at the national level, is start to put those targets into place at that national level.
Great. And of course, it's not just for governments, is it? It's for businesses as well. I mean, you represent the business community, you're working for KPMG. I mean, you could sort of think of so many businesses here. Is this just an exercise in corporate greenwash, or is there something real for businesses to do to implement the convention?
Yeah, so actually that's a piece of work that we've been doing at KPMG, is to say, okay, there are these 23 targets, but what does this all mean for a business? Because actually, if you are a business and if you've looked at some of the negotiating text, it might not make sense to you. So actually, what does that mean, each of those targets that we should do as businesses? And so what we've done is we've provided against each of those 23 targets, and for each sector, so let's take the agri-food sector, what are the types of actions that those businesses can take sector by sector and target by target for all of the 23 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework.
And why would businesses bother? I mean, it's like saving nature. It's not really a business thing to do, is it? Or is there actually a good economic reason to actually do something about this?
So we actually brought together 20 of the world's global businesses to talk about this exact issue. And we asked them that very question, which was, why does this matter to you? And some of their answers came back, which is around actually aligning, because they need to do it from a regulation point of view.
Okay, so they're being told by governments.
Yes, for things like the CSRD, this new EU regulation.
CSRD, sorry.
Yeah. So new EU regulation, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which means all businesses over a certain size need to comply with this regulation. And so within that, actually, there is wording which asks businesses to set out how they are contributing to the Global Biodiversity Framework.
Okay,
so there is a regulatory sort of stick.
So if a company was trashing nature, and they're a big company working within the auspices of the European Union, that's not necessarily UK, of course, but lots of our UK companies are still working in Europe, they're going to have to admit in their corporate reports that they're trashing nature, which is presumably a pretty difficult thing to do.
So what they're actually looking at first is actually what are their sort of impacts and their dependencies on nature. So first of all, what they call their nature risk? And that means, let's take a sort of large coffee company, and we're looking at their supply chain. And if their supply chain is actually reliant on key commodities or key nature and biodiversity to actually be produced, then if nature and biodiversity is declining, then that's going to impact their supply chain. So that, to them and for their business, is a nature risk. And
okay, so it's not just about regulation, it's actually about the, I always thought, like, if you, for example, we argue about neonics use in the UK, and it's kind of like, it seems crazy to destroy the very pollinators that pollinate a third of all the crops. I mean, that just feels like kind of suicide now. I mean, is this the sort of thing that we're talking about?
Yes, exactly. And actually, many businesses are already seeing these nature risks play out already. So they're already seeing the impact of declines in nature on the sustainability of their supply chains. But they don't just see it as a nature risk as well. And we'll see lots and lots of conversations here over the next few weeks about how do you start to see nature as an economic opportunity as well. So in terms of investing in nature, start to see some return on investment in nature if you're investing in it, and putting in place nature positive strategies. Would that business start to see a return on their business as as a sort of consequence of those actions.
So I guess one of the functions of a COP then is not just the international agreement going on and all the discussions around that, which principally the government's doing. It's actually a place where you can share at an international level kind of good practice and knowledge exchange and so on.
That's what I always think that there's two parts to a COP. There is the governments, and that what they're doing is very important, those negotiations, because they're setting out the sort of framework of what we all need to deliver.
Yeah.
So that's it. We're all pointing in the same direction. But then the other very important part of COPs for me is actually all about bringing different people together, different sectors, different communities, different countries actually, and learning from each other and sharing between us what the types of solutions are that we can come out with for nature and biodiversity.
Brilliant. Do you know what? I think that's so important for the UK because we're as an island nature, as an island nation, we've got that kind of British exception as if we know better than anybody else. In fact, there's 192 countries here at COP, and surely we can learn the really good stuff that's happening in other countries. Hey, look, I've got a question here from Steve Tompkins. Thank you, Steve. He says, can you provide an idea when the UK government will publish the targets, and will this be through DEFRA? Any ideas?
Yeah, so DEFRA is the lead department who will be leading on the UK government plan, so the UK National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and they had intended to actually publish that in time for this COP. Obviously, with a change of government, there's been a few delays, but what they have said, they've committed to publishing that by early 2025. So we're expecting to see that soon. They've already put forward some targets, some technical targets to the Convention of Biodiversity of what they're intending to do, but that full national strategy will come out in 2025. I think it's probably quite important to say at this point that all of the indications from the UK actually are quite positive. So I don't know whether your listeners have seen, but actually yesterday there was a new UK nature envoy announced, a lady called Ruth Davis, who comes from an environmental background. So really positive signs in terms of the UK taking this seriously and really wanting to drive it forwards and show this sort of global leadership role.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in the run-up to COP15, the last COP in Montreal, which set out the global biodiversity framework, I think the UK, correct me if I'm wrong here, the UK was part of a high ambition group to drive that agreement through. There does seem to be a bit of a mismatch, really, between that kind of ambition at an international level and then what we're really doing at home, which is, let's face it, not great at the moment.
Yeah, and that is always the case, actually. And I think that's one of the really important things of what they're going to discuss over the next 2 weeks, which is how do you actually see and compare country by country what each country is doing at the national level and how that then all adds up towards that global goals, those global sort of targets. So how do we compare country by country to say, for example, is the UK doing better or worse than Colombia, where we are now, or Mexico, or South Africa? So that's one of the very key things that will be being discussed.
Brilliant. Look, we're going to have to wrap up now because we've had our time. Look, but fantastic introduction, and thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us. Great introduction to the COP16 process. We'll be back tomorrow at roughly the same time. Let's hope we don't have too many technical problems again. And be joined by the Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust, Craig Bennett, and our Director of Climate, Catherine Brown. So thank you again, Sarah, and we'll see you all tomorrow.